I've got an iPad set up as like a third monitor. So share sound, see the browser. All right. Can we see everything here, team? Perfect. I'm gonna move Zoom over here. Awesome. All
Maybe,
right. What's that?
sorry, David, maybe just zoom in a little bit.
Yeah, that's good. I zoomed in the same as last time, so I'm trying to find that sweet spot of how much to zoom in. Is that a little better?
I think so.
Okay. How about everyone else? Is that looking good or going a little bit more? I think this is about 175. So I'll make a note of that here. 175%. Awesome. All right. Well, we are getting into HTML today. Very excited to finally start coding. But before we start, how's everyone feeling about our first actual coding lesson today? We pretty excited, a little hesitant, a little nervous. All of those are very valid feelings, but would love to see how we're at before we dive in here. Got a few people type in. On hype, love it. Curious, that's a great response. Excited, and we get the emoji too. Awesome. Just waiting for the thing I want. Okay, I'm curious what that is. So let's go ahead and start with the overview. So HTML is going to be what's called a markup language, and this is what we're going to use for creating web pages. So today we're going to explore a couple different tags, look at how HTML files are structured, and by the end of this lesson, what we're looking to have you be able to do is write and structure an HTML document, utilize key HTML tags and elements, and then we're going to create a basic web page using HTML. Let's get this little Zoom bar out of the way here. Awesome. Okay. So as always, we have a little bit of a warm up, some discussion time. So I don't know how many of y'all remember, but back in the day, newspapers used to have classified sections, right? And that's where you could find jobs, you could actually sell things. I had seen even like farming, maybe you're trying to sell crops, right? It's the classified sections really anything you could put in there. But that's not normal anymore, right? Whether it's jobs being on LinkedIn or if you're selling things, it's Facebook Marketplace. So that's kind of the transition we've made in that regard. So keeping that in mind, what do you think were some advantages and disadvantages of using actual print media like a newspaper compared to online platforms like Facebook Marketplace? And this is something we can drop in the chat here for the discussion. Also, the Simpsons GIF. Yes, thank you. Let's see. Less people trying to scam you for services and articles. Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a gatekeeper there, right? Is you would have to actually submit the information to a real person and they could curate whether you posted it or whether it was posted or not. So Tatiana said the actual status of things. So I'm if you could flesh that out, I'm curious what you mean there in regards to like a newspaper or Facebook. Omar said a standard layout. Yeah, I mean, obviously every newspaper would be a little different, right? But you have Facebook now where everything is pretty consistent and having images, a description, a location. So I would say Facebook has standardized that. Joseph said limited on the number of people you could reach. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and that goes both ways, right? Is with Facebook, you could find a listing that you think is local to you and it's really not, but Facebook still wants to show it to you, right? Tatiana said on a newspaper, you don't know if the thing is still for sale. Yeah, that's correct. You'd have to wait for the next print cycle, right? And it could even sell minutes after the next print cycle. So you're absolutely right. That was kind of hit or miss there. We'll do a couple more here. Chris said it's always there for you as a hard copy and can't be deleted like Facebook. Yeah, that's true. And then we have people can contribute by posting their comments. Yeah, so that is something where this Facebook has more of that social element, whereas the newspaper did not. So great responses here. So looking at the next question, how looking at the shift from print to digital, I think we've kind of already touched on that, right? But how has it affected the accessibility and reach? And again, it's not even necessarily we need to look at a positive, it could be a negative too. I think Joseph mentioned that, right? Is it could be limited, but we could also see, like, I know I was looking for some games for my kids and I was looking at listings and they're hundreds of miles away, right? But it's still the same state. So Facebook thought I would be interested in it. Let's see, if it's frequent seller, it's easier to see that on a platform like Facebook or eBay. Yes, absolutely. You have those reviews which come in handy, and you can't review them unless you actually purchase something from them. Nowadays have a lot of spam. Yes. So the accessibility and reach, I mean, unfortunately, you go on to find a listing, you don't even know if it's real, right? It may have legitimate images, but maybe it was already sold and someone's trying to sell you something else. I've reached out for listings and then they're trying to sell me on some, pyramid scheme. And I'm like, that's not why I reached out. Gets better as you can get more resources from different sites. Absolutely. So yeah, I think we agree. Like there's more reach. Like you can see a post go further, but that doesn't necessarily entail quality, right? So great responses here. We've got one more as well. So now that we've kind of considered that, how do we think HTML? And if you don't know anything about HTML yet, that's absolutely fine. So how do you think that plays a role in how these ads are created and how we see them? Right. So compared to print, where you'd actually have to lay everything out, how do we think HTML would change that being online? And just as a refresher too, these discussion questions are trying to help us get into the thought process of going through these lessons, right? Instead of just jumping right in and here's an info dump, it gives us a few minutes, kind of warm our brains up, and shift into what we're going to be talking about. So none of this is graded, but it's a good exercise. Like we've got a few people typing here. I'm going to close that out. I'll give it another minute while people are typing. Okay, so Joseph, with HTML advancement in web pages, you're able to target a specific audience with ads. So that's part of it. The ads we'll get into like JavaScript, and there's more data analytics and stuff. But yeah, I mean, you definitely are able to construct things you wouldn't have been able to before. So great response. So we see gives you a lot more control over the layout of the items and services you're trying to sell. Yeah, I mean that's really good. I love that thought because in print, you'd try something out and you'd have to let it run its cycle, and then you'd have to wait for the next release. Whereas, with like HTML and different programming, you're able to try something out, and if it doesn't work, you could technically go in and Facebook could make that change pretty quickly, right? You don't have to wait for someone to download and update if it's on a browser, right? They just would go and they would view the updated version. So, and then last one here, it's allowed web browsers to click on links and be redirected to a new page. Yeah, it keeps people hooked, right? You could go to a listing, oh, hey, look at this one here, and you keep clicking, and then 3 hours later, you realize you've been on your phone, and it's 2 in the morning. So, great thoughts here. So, getting into HTML, if you remember last week, we talked about how HTML is if we had a sentence, it would be the noun of a sentence, right? It's the structure of the house. It is what is the bones of our web page. So every web page you're going to create with HTML, there's always going to be the same structure. Okay. So we're going to have four different elements, and we'll get into those more, but we're going to see it's doc type, HTML, head, and body. Okay. So before we move forward, just a reminder, you're going to see the caret symbols are less than and greater than. Every tag in HTML is going to have those. Okay. So the first one will be the less than, and then the end will be the greater than. So every HTML tag will have the same format there. So when we create an HTML document, we have to declare what kind of type it is. Over the years, there's been various versions of HTML, and currently we're on what's called HTML5. Okay. So by adding this tag, where we have the caret and then exclamation mark, sometimes it's referred to as bang, and then we have doc type in all capital letters, and we have HTML. What that's saying is, hey, we're going to have a doc type, and what follows after that is going to be the type of file. 9 times out of 10, this is all you're going to see. So it's not even something you're really going to have to memorize, because as we'll learn down the road, there are shortcuts to help create the skeleton of this page fairly easily, but it's always going to have this format. And when you see this, this actually will tell the browser that it's going to be what's called HTML5. So what happens is that browser knows if it's HTML5, there's going to be certain rules to follow, and it's going to go ahead and look at that document and apply those rules. Does that make sense to everyone? So they read it and they say, oh, hey, this is HTML5, not HTML4. So certain what we would learn as syntax or how the code is arranged, the browser is going to interpret it accordingly. So once we actually create that document and we say, hey, this is going to be a doc type of HTML, we're going to have some elements, and it's going to be an HTML element. So like I was talking about last week, you can think of these HTML tags as kind of like a sandwich, right? So when you have, and I'm going to highlight it here, when you have this HTML tag that's opening, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a closing tag. So that means everything inside of here is going to be HTML. So we have the opening tag that just says HTML, and the closing tag that'll have a / HTML, and everything inside of there is going to be HTML. Now, you're not going to see CSS, you're not going to see JavaScript like that. It's all going to be different. So HTML kind of just understand, like when you have those brackets like that or those elements, that's a little bit unique compared to the other languages. And then next, we're going to have what's called a head element. Okay. So we have the HTML, and then we have the head. So inside of here, this gives us a chance to start customizing the website a little bit. So we can add links. We've already kind of talked about links a little bit. So we could link to a CSS file or a JavaScript file. So what happens is you can make a link, and then you're saying, hey, I want to reference this file, and that file gets injected into your HTML. Before I move on, I saw Mohammed, great question. Can CSS and JavaScript be embedded within the HTML? Yes, it can. There are specific scripts that we can add, and we'll get into that. But it's just going to look a little different. It's not going to be like the tag says CSS. It actually, we'll learn it's called style. And then JavaScript would be script, but we'll get to that here shortly. So what's important to know about the head tag is it's not actually something you're going to see on the page explicitly. So later on, we'll see what's called a body tag. You'll see what's in the body tag. But the head tag is what we call metadata. So it's an important way to help with styles. If you were to go to Google, for example, if I was to search for let's think. One of my favorite bands, Between the Buried and Me. So you'll see here, there's like listen, watch, tour dates, mailing list. This Facebook link says, in beautiful Denver for 2 nights, tickets are still available, so bring your entire crew. This is all technically metadata. Okay, now it may be from the like the body, but somehow in the HTML, it's saying, hey, I want you to pull this content and display it as metadata. And we're going to get into that here shortly. So the metadata is really helpful for what's called SEO, which is search engine optimization. So that makes sure if I search on Google for Between the Buried and Me, I'm going to find things about that instead of Maine Coon cats, right? So search engine optimization is really important. Is everyone tracking so far? How are we feeling as we're going over these elements? We're going to get a little bit more hands-on here in a second, but just quick overview of what we're expecting on each page. And Mohammed, yes, it can be a snippet for search engines. Absolutely. There's a lot you can do with metadata and SEO, and that's why that is a career for some people, is to only focus on SEO optimization. Okay, so I'm not seeing any concerned faces in the chat or on Zoom, so that's good. So let's go ahead to the next page and we're gonna throw this in here, okay? So at least we're gonna see what it looks like, right? So when we create a head element, we can add what's called a title, okay? And a title, again, is metadata. It's not something that you're actually gonna see on the page, but the browser is going to take that information and then display it in a certain point, in a certain spot. So if I was to click this little blue arrow, which I would encourage everyone to do this the same, you see here at the bottom, if you want to view the page in a new browser tab, we can do that. We click this blue arrow, and up here at the top on the tab, you will see Sunny's Paint Shop. Okay, so that right here is metadata. It's saying we want this web page's title to be Sunny's Paint Shop. So if I was to change this to the best gifts ever, and then I was to refresh, I would see that the title up here was changed to the best gifts ever, because that's what we have determined should be the name of this web page. So as a reminder, the main structure we have here is we have whatever doctype it is. And then inside of there, we want to say, hey, this is going to be HTML. So we have our head element, and inside of there, we throw a title, and then we'll get into the body here shortly. So if I was to change this, if I was to take the title and put it in the body, it would still technically work, okay? Because HTML is a little forgiving, but from an SEO standpoint, you would be shooting yourself in the foot there. So we definitely don't want to do that. Again, we're going to learn HTML, JavaScript. There's a lot of forgiveness, a lot of flexibility, but it's always important to follow proper syntax. So who here pays attention to when you go to a website and you see that little icon in the browser? Does anyone notice that from web page to web page? It's typically unique. So that's what we would call a favicon, which actually really stands for favorite icon. How this worked back in the day is you would have a icon saved on a web page's like database, right? Their server. And every time someone would bookmark that page, it would request that file. And in your bookmarks, it would save that image. And web pages, or I guess companies, would track how many times that image was requested. And that was their way of keeping track of traffic, right? Of how many people actually bookmarked that page. Nowadays, what we're doing is we just want to keep track of well, what kind of web page is it, right? It's a marketing thing. It's a way to distinguish yourself from other websites. So you notice here, if you're in Codio, you'll see this little blue box with a C, and it's the Codio logo. So typically, favicons are in what's called an ICO format, but you could use a PNG file, you could use a GIF file. Um, Typically, you want to keep it 16 by 16 pixels. Okay. And really, all you have to do is, as long as you have the file hosted in your web page, you could add this link element. Okay. And you have to specify what kind of relationship it is to the web page. So we say icon. We say what kind of type it is, right? So image /X icon. And then this href, we're going to learn it's called a linked resource. This is where we actually add the file name in here. So again, if we were to click the blue arrow, we'll see up top, you will see an image of a spray can. So to Dragos's point, could you actually use an animated GIF for a favicon? Yeah, you totally could. It's just not considered best practice because A, you don't know if it's going to work 100% of browsers. And then B, it's just doesn't have that same professional flair as just like a logo. But yeah, you totally could. I used to do that a lot back in the day. I thought it was fun. I learned it's just not considered best practice. Uh, let's see. There was another question too. I think that's really important. Is HTML case sensitive and is indentation important? Yes, HTML case it is case sensitive, especially if you're not keeping it consistent. So it is important if you're doing title lowercase that you have title up lowercase as well. Indentation is less important. It's more for readability, right? So if I was to have, it's not going to let me edit it, but if I was to have this tabbed all the way over to the right, that wouldn't be helpful. Okay. So we want to make sure that we have it in a spot where it's readable because you're going to see here when we talked about like the sandwich, right, which is considered nesting, it's really important that I know how this is lined up because eventually you might have 6 or 7 different elements nested in another element, which is nested in another element. So having that organization and that proper indentation is really important. All right. So before we actually move on to the exercise that we have next to go over some metadata, uh, just want to make sure, how are we feeling so far? Again, I know this is new, so I want to make sure we're not rushing through this. Okay. We've got a great, we've got a big thumbs up. So far, so good. Awesome. So this exercise here, let's go ahead, it's going to be a bit hands-on. Okay. So we're going to talk about what are called open graph meta tags. Okay. So this would give us the ability to view how our web page would look when it's shared on different social media platforms. So depending on your network, you may have a VPN at work. It may not display everything we want. I want to give you a heads up on that. But what we're going to do is in our head element, we are going to add what's called an open graph meta tag, and we're going to specify what the title is when the web page is shared on social media. Okay. So here on Codio, when you see this code block, there's a little clipboard here. If we click that, that'll copy it. So then I can paste this into the HTML file. Okay. So for my sake, I'm going to change it. I'm going to say SD6 and I'll say Sunny's paint shop. Okay. So again, what we're doing here is we're saying OG for open graph, and then we have a colon and we're saying title. And in this content attribute, we're specifying what the website title should display if I was to share this somewhere. And now we're going to go ahead and add a new meta tag. And this is going to add the description. Okay. So this is how we would want the web page to be described, like that little summary spot there. So we'll say we paint all of your Lord of the Rings action figures. Why not? Okay. And then here, we are going to have an image that we can share. So typically, when you share a link on Facebook, you'd have like that preview image, right? So this is going to allow us to set that preview image. So what we'll do is this one, it is important. We're going to take this tiny URL link where it says C1-spray-can-bottles, and we're going to replace this content between the quotation marks, and we're going to replace it with this link. Okay. So again, you can use the clipboard here, copy that link over, and then change the content between the quotation mark. So step 4, what we want to do is you can hit refresh. You're not going to see anything yet. But over here in our rightmost tab, we're going to see this address, right? So HTTPS, yours is going to be different, but it's all going to have some kind of random words separated with a hyphen, .codio.io, okay? So I'm going to copy that, and we're going to click this link here that says metatags.io. And if I go in here and I parse the metadata, I should see this update. And like I said, sometimes the images won't always load. It depends on internet connection. I've been having issues with this. I had it working the other day. It's not working today. So it's going to be kind of hit or miss on the image. But you'll see that right here, here's what the Google preview looks like. So we paint all of your Lord of the Rings action figures, right? So I could go back into here, change the name and say Sunny's Paint Shop, okay? And then I will parse that metadata again. It's already updated. That's awesome, right? So this here, the Open Graph meta tags, this just allows you to be a little bit more specific about how you want your website to appear when you share it on these different platforms. Does that make sense? Cool. We got a bunch of yeses, got some thumbs up. Awesome. So if you want to look at more meta tags, we did make sure to include this link for you here as well. Okay. Awesome. So this is where we're going to spend most of our time with HTML, and it's going to be the body element. So this is where you are going to see all of the visible content displayed on a web page. Now, we can still have things inside of a body tag that aren't visible immediately. Don't want to get too far ahead, but that is the purpose here, where if you see a web page and it has text, images, links, videos, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be in the body. So the head element provides that metadata. It provides instructions to the browser to render content a certain way. Whereas the body, that's where you want to place everything for a user to see and interact with. This is how you're going to define what the web page actually looks like. So in this example here, we're going to see a bunch of text, okay? So heading elements are really important. This is how we not only display text, but it's actually going to be how we organize text. So if you were to go to Google Docs, for example, and it's going to make me log in, let's go ahead and do that. If I was to type hello fellows, here you would see, like title, subtitle, heading. This is pretty standard. We see this all the time, right? When it comes to HTML, the heading elements are important, but it's less about the size. Now, the size is important. You'll see that each heading element has different sizes, but it's less about the specific size because you can always change that down the road with CSS. It's all about importance. So for example, an H1 element or a heading 1 element, this is the most important text on the page. It's best practice, for example, to only have one on each page. So you could have multiple H2s, H6s, but you should only have one H1 on each page. So as it says here, it starts as an H1 and you can go all the way down to an H6. So really what that's saying is the H1 should be the most important text, the H2 should be the second most important text, and it goes on from there. Now, again, these are only heading elements, right? We'll get into paragraph tags, spans, other kinds of text elements, but this is where you have your headers and your subheaders that signify importance to a page. This is not, again, just for display purposes, but also for screen readers and for accessibility. It's really important to signify what text is going to be more important than the other. So we could go in here and I could do an H3, right? I don't know if it'll let me do that. Yep. So fun little trick here in Codio, and if you use VS Code, you can type the word lorem and then hit tab, and it'll generate some lorem ipsum for you. So we can do an H4. I'll do lorem times 3, and I'll get 3 things of lorem ipsum on here. But as you notice, the text gets smaller as it goes down. So again, the text size does matter, but you don't choose the heading element based on the size. You choose it based on the importance, and then we'll learn how to change text size later on. Mohammed asks, so this is useful for bots to understand how the web page is organized while crawling. Yes, that is spot on. That is very astute of you. Yeah. So again, it's for a visible organization, but it's also for search engines, for anyone else that may be coming to the site and viewing the code more than what is visible. So again, you're going to see here at the bottom, we like to link MDN. We talked about them last week. So if you are curious about section headings, you can always come back after class and view this link. We want to make sure to give you as many resources as possible. So paragraph tags, I had just mentioned this previously. So whereas we have the heading elements to organize the text to display importance, a paragraph tag is a way to add a paragraph to your text. So what happens here is if we have this paragraph element, which reminder that most HTML elements will have an opening tag and a closing tag. So everything inside of that is going to be rendered on the web page as a paragraph. And what's awesome is the browsers will automatically add a blank line before and after. Okay. So just like most books or newspapers or printed text that you read, a paragraph is portioned off or sectioned off from another paragraph. Otherwise, it would just be a big block of text and it would be hard to read. So this is a great way to organize what you want to share on a web page and also have it readable as well. But going back to previous points, it's an organization too, right? If something is inside of a paragraph, you would assume it's related, and the next paragraph is going to have its own organization. So the awesome thing is, you can have paragraphs as long as you want, right? So I could go in here, that little lorem trick I showed you. So I could do lorem times 50, and I hit tab. It's a very, very long paragraph. Now, should you have a paragraph this long? No, absolutely not. But this gives us the flexibility to have paragraph elements as short as we want or as long as we want. Okay. And again, as I'm going through this, feel free to jump into the code, start working on some things. You will never get to a point where you break something in here that we can't fix. Okay. So that's going to be one of the best ways to learn, is to break things and to try things out. So again, as we're going through this, it's great if you can kind of dive in there and code along a little bit. Okay. Speaking of that, we're going to get to the exercise here. Okay. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to try this out on your own. And then if you get it, let's add a screenshot or you can say in the chat. But we'll take a couple minutes here and we're going to try to add some more heading elements and paragraphs to this web page to go ahead and provide some more information. Okay. So the first step here is we're going to use an H3 tag and we're going to add a section heading called glossy paints below the introductory content. So that's going to be below these two paragraphs. After that, we're going to add a paragraph tag, and we're going to go ahead and add this text here. Okay. Next, we'll add another H3 tag, use glossy paints as the heading text, and we're going to do the same thing for the metallic paints description. So ultimately, what you should be doing is steps 1 and 2. You're going to add a section with a heading element and a paragraph tag. We'll do another H3 with another paragraph for steps 3 and 4. And we're going to do the same thing for 5 and 6. So let's take a couple minutes, try that out. And then once we've given that a shot, I'll go ahead and show you how to do it. If anyone had any issues, and we'll go from there. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. And at any time too, you can always throw questions into the extra help channel, whether that's during the live session or outside, and we will jump in and help you as needed. I will say I learned a lot about paint after designing one of my lizards enclosure. I built a custom background. I mean, I spent way too much money on it, spent a lot of time on it, but it looks awesome. So let's see. We've got a few examples in here. Perfect. Good job, Dragos. Looks like. And I have gone through to try to find pronunciation, so I apologize. Looks like Asar shared theirs as well. Great job. And as we're going to learn now and for our lab today, don't worry so much about how the website is styled, right? That's where we get into CSS. So we're just really trying to figure out how do we get the structure here. And then from there with CSS, that's when we can start making it look unique. That's when we can start giving it a bit of personality. So now that we have a couple examples in there, I'm going to go ahead and do it for myself as well. So in Codio, we have a tool that's called emit. So what you could do is if you type H3 and hit tab, it will actually create that element for you. Okay. Now, we haven't gone over this yet, but if I was to type image and hit tab, you'll notice that it doesn't have a closing tag. Okay. That's what we call a void element. We'll get into that here shortly. So as long as you type the right element name and you hit tab, it'll auto-populate your opening and closing tag as needed for you. So that makes it very handy. So let's go ahead and add glossy paint between this H3 tag. I'll do a key tag. I'll copy this text. And I'm a big proponent of test often. So now that I added a little bit in here, I'll hit refresh and I'll see that everything is rendered as expected. So we have a good amount of spacing here between the heading element and the paragraphs. So we'll go ahead and do another. Do an H3, add metallic paints. And we'll add our text here. Make sure everything's rendering correctly. Perfect. And we'll do it one more time. And back to the point about indentation, I'll show you a tool here in Codio as well that will help. Let's add the paragraph tag. Oh, Omar shared the actual code. Great job. So it looks like, Omar, in your example, I see a closing body tag, but it looks like, I don't know if maybe something got removed from there, but we want to make sure we have the opening body tag too. So if I hit refresh, so we have everything here. So really handy tool in Codio is if you go to tools and you go to what's called beautify, you'll notice that everything gets lined up indentation wise. So if I was to accidentally tab out all this way and I didn't want to undo everything, right? I could do a few more tabs, go to tools, beautify, and it lines everything up for you. Oh, Omar, it looks like you didn't get the entire thing in copy paste. Gotcha. Okay. Well, still great work. So before we move on, what are our thoughts here? We're kind of building out maybe our first web page. Maybe you've made a page before, but how's this feeling? Kind of getting our hands dirty here a little bit, starting to structure things out. Hopefully we don't have anyone overwhelmed, but I'm not seeing anything video wise to make me think that. All right, looks like we have some typing here in the chat. Okay. Well, for not getting any upset emoji faces or anything, I think that's a good sign for us to keep going here. So we've already seen some examples of what's called an HTML element. So this is what we would consider a component or a building block of a document that tells the browser how to render the web page. So it's just like any language, right? We see a word or a phrase or a set of letters, and we have to interpret that. The browser does that interpretation for us. So not only does it determine how to display it, but again, that's the semantic, that syntax significance will help render it in a search engine, right? Or an email preview. So again, we look here at this text and it says, this is my personal website. So what we could do is if we want it to be standalone, we would just put it inside of the paragraph tags, right? This is an HTML element. So getting into the anatomy of what an HTML element is, we've kind of already talked about this, but we have the opening tag, and then we're going to have the content, and then we're going to have the closing tag. So the opening tag is going to specify when some content is about to begin, right? The content is what the actual content, whether it's a text, maybe it's some image, right? Now that comes from, we'll see here in a minute, attributes, but it's still content. And then the closing tag is how it ends. So for example, if I was to have a paragraph tag like this, hello, this is some text, but then I accidentally did this. I'm going to zoom in here. It's kind of a gamble how this would be rendered. Most browsers would know that this H3 is really separate from the paragraph tag, but it's really hard to know how that would be rendered because it's mixed together. So that's why it's important if we have HTML elements that we would close the tags and open the tags accordingly. So now we have our paragraph tag separated, we have our heading element separated, and we'll get into inline elements, but 9 times out of 10, you want to keep your elements separated like this. So nesting elements, for example, this is where it may actually be worth having that nested element here. And I think what we'll do is I'll keep CodePen open. I don't know if anyone has used CodePen, but this will be an easy way for me to show stuff when I don't have the page to display. So if we look here at this content, we do have what's called a nested tag, okay? So I'll zoom in here a little bit. So we have a paragraph tag. This is my personal website. But then we have a nested element, the strong element, which makes this text bold. It gives significance to that text, not just from a visual standpoint, but from an accessibility standpoint. It knows that this text should have some emphasis. Whereas if we took this element that we had earlier, let's see how it ends up being rendered. We'll do H3, adding element. So it does technically render it right. So hello, this is some text, and then we have the heading element, but you're kind of gambling. There's a lot of issues that could arise down the road when we get into, if you remember, CSS selectors, right? So again, HTML can be kind of forgiving, but it is important to know. Could it impact SEO? Yeah, I mean, totally. And that's where I couldn't point that out because getting into that, it would take, obviously, you have to publish the website, days, but that's why it's just important to make sure you're proofreading your text, right? Having that proper syntax. But again, there are times where we will want nested elements. So if I go back to this example, you could also have there's a couple different instances. You could have like an I tag. You could have I'm trying to think of some other ones we could do here. There's the nested elements. Yep, U is another one. I was trying to remember. They've gone away from changing like I and B and U to other names for accessibility purposes. But if I was to use the U tag, it would underline it. Right. So it's still a paragraph tag. We're just making that stylistic change here instead of through CSS, for example. Now, void elements are self-closing tags. This is what we had seen before. Okay. So typically an HTML element is going to need an opening and closing tag. But a few don't need that, right? Because here we don't have technically that content inside of those two tags. To create an image, we use what's called a source attribute, and then we pass in what's called the path of the image in that attribute. So instead of having image, here is the path, and then a closing image tag like that, right? Now, again, this is where HTML is just going to kind of do its own thing. The browser is going to do its own thing and render it. This isn't how an HTML tag works. Instead, if I was to go to Google Images, let's see between the buried and me again, not type again. So I could take this image here, copy image address, and in the source attribute, I could paste that image and it renders the image for us because we passed in that path into the source attribute. So since there is no actual content, we don't need an opening tag and we don't need a closing tag. Okay. Does that make sense so far? To get a yes. Let's give it a second. Got a thumbs up. Can we also use attributes for void elements? Yes. So void elements and self-closing, like they're technically the same thing. So for example, you could also have an alt attribute, which is what's considered alternative text. We'll get into that later. But yes, all HTML elements will have some sort of attribute that you can use, but they don't always have the same attributes. Again, we'll learn about that much further down. So here's an example, okay? We are going to get into what are called structural elements. So these aren't necessarily things that you would explicitly see always, but it's a way to help organize your web page as well. Okay. So these create a backbone of a web page. So it helps define these areas. So we may have like a header section, a footer section, navigation areas, main content, right? So as we see here, we have the header element, which, oh man, it's unorganized. Does anyone remember what we do to organize it again? I'm drawing a blank. I don't know why I'm probably hot in here. Beautify. Perfect. Thanks, Dragos. So we could do beautify here. What do you know? It's all organized for us, right? And you can see here, that's a great GIF. You can see how easy it is to view this, right? So what's nice is this line goes all the way down from the opening tag to the closing tag, right? So we know that everything inside of here is going to be inside of our header section. And again, just a reminder, if you hover over the elements, you're going to get the MDN reference for each element tag. Okay, so if you're struggling to remember what something is, just hover over that bad boy, you're good to go. So inside of our header, we have our H1, because remember, that's the most important heading element, right? So we have our H1, and then we have a nav section, right? So this is what would help navigate the user throughout the web page. We'll learn about these elements later, but it's called an unordered list and then a list item. Okay. So we have some links here. Now, they're not going to go anywhere right now, but that's our navigation section inside of our header section. And then we just have a section itself, which is just a generic container. Okay. So it doesn't have to mean anything. You could have 5 different sections. And then inside of here, you'll see an H2. We have a paragraph. And then here at the bottom, we have the footer, right? So this is where it contains information about maybe who made the web page. Maybe you have some more navigation down there, right? So if we go back to CodePen, if you go to the main page, we'll see that they have a footer down here, right? So a bit of navigation here, but they also have the copyright. They have a little tagline here, and you can view their terms of service and privacy policy. So obviously you don't want your main content in the footer, right? But you can still have important information there. So these elements will all organize things based on what purpose they play for the web page. And then we're going to get into text content. So we've already gone over paragraph tag. We've already gone over heading elements. But we also have things called block quotes. So block quotes are useful if you want to indent text based on a quote, like in a book, where if I think the general rule of thumb is if you quote someone and it's more than like a sentence or two, you're supposed to block quote instead of having a inline quotation in that paragraph. So what we could do here is let's do a little bit more lorem ipsum to kind of make this more visible. So we could do lorem times 1, and then we'll do lorem times 3 or 4. Whoops. So you see here, we have our regular paragraph tag, and then here is our block quote. So the text itself is the same formatting, right? It's still a paragraph, but it has that indentation signify that this is actually going to be someone else's verbiage, their own words. Okay. So that would be the purpose of the block quote. And then we also have a pre element. So this means it's pre-formatted text. Okay. So you see here, they can have multiple lines. It's actually we were talking about indentation before. This is where that indentation does matter. See, I backspaced out of there to go this far out, and it's rendered accordingly. Now, I will say from experience, I don't think I've ever used this tag in a professional work environment. It was typically more common when you would not utilize CSS as often. But in poetry, for example, this pre-element would be very helpful, right? Because poetry is read not just on the words, but the format, the layout. So this would come in handy for things like that. And then we're going to get into what are called inline text elements. So we saw previously the strong element, right? And how, even though we added this element inside of another element, it didn't break anything up because it's what we consider inline. It means that this element doesn't have to get a new line on the web page for it to be visible. So on this web page example, we see a paragraph that has what's called a element. This is a hyperlink element. So this would allow us to go to a new page. So if I was to change this href attribute to say https google.com, and I was to refresh, if I click on that, in the browser, it won't work. If I was to open this up in a new window, it would. So we see that clicking on it takes us to Google. Okay. But again, the text itself doesn't get broken onto a new line like that paragraph element. So that paragraph element is what we'd call a block element, and we'll get into that. But we see the important text is bolded. The emphasized, or what used to be italicized text, it has the italics, right? But it's on its same line. And then we also have what's called a BR. And this is a void element, so there's not going to be a opening and closing tag, but it's going to be a line break. So I could go in here and do BR, and everywhere I added that BR, now it breaks to a new line. Okay. Everyone tracking so far? So we have inline elements that can live within a line or another element. They can be nested, but as we see with the BR, we can also break onto a new line too. So now we're going to look at image elements, which we've already kind of done so far. So we have this image element here, which represents an image. So the source is, where are we getting this image from? And when we see something like this, where there's no HTTPS or www, it means it's locally hosted. So if I was to go here, and I don't know if you'll have access to this or not, but if I was to go to view and file tree, I would see that example, let's see which one this is. I don't have the actual name here. I think it's example, let's go to 7. Okay, example 8. We would see that we have an image.png. So what this is saying is, hey, inside of this folder, I want to find the image.png file, okay? And the alt text, so this here, I'll make it a little bit bigger for you if you can't see. This is going to create what's called an alternative text description. So let's say someone tries to view your website and the image is broken, or the internet's slow, or some people actually don't enable images in their browsers at all. They only want the text. So this would replace that text or that image with that text. So if for some reason this wasn't to render, then we would see description of an image. So if this works, I would hit refresh and we see a broken image. Okay. And then we see description of image. So I could say Codio logo, hit refresh, and there we go. So the alternative text is really important, not just for accessibility, which is very important, but sometimes things will happen where maybe a storage account goes down and the image doesn't display, but at least you could have that alternative text to say, you know, what the user would have expected at that time. Dragos adds something here in the chat. Did some training on Amazon Library. It advised to use good description for alt descriptions, as many users that are visually impaired might find those really useful. Yes, absolutely. Obviously, there's bad ways to write alternative text, being too verbose. Um, but yeah, there's definitely good ways to do it as well, and it's very important to add those. And then we also hear where the audio source is similar thing, right? It's a file, it's a wave file, and then controls is an attribute that you don't actually have to set a value to. So you see here, if I was to hit play, you should have heard that beep noise, right? So the controls means that we can actually go in here and adjust different things. If I was to remove controls and hit refresh, well, I don't see it, right? So it depends on what you want to do with your audio. So that's where this attribute would come into play. Again, we're not going to get super deep into this. We just want to get you all familiar with what these elements look like. We'll definitely get more into the image elements. I will say from personal experience, videos and especially audio are less frequent because of A, load times, and then B, also accessibility. So now we're going to get into embedded elements. And this is what you will probably see more often than not. Um, for example, we have what's called an iframe here. And this is typically what you would see. And an iframe is a way where you can take someone else's content and safely display it in yours. Okay, so we see here on this web page, there's a single element or a single HTML element called an iframe. We set the width and the height. The source is a YouTube video, so it's the correlation one video. And we allow different things in here, right? So if I was to hit play, it would actually, let me drag this over here. We have an attribute that allows full screen, right? We also say that they can do web share. There's different things we could pass in here. But the important thing, and this is saying we set the dimensions. So here we see a width, what it's saying is 560 pixels, and we're saying 315 pixels. So if I was to go down and say 200 and 100 and hit refresh, we're going to see a very tiny YouTube video, right? It's going to be hard to do anything on there. So that's where you get to go in and customize that a bit. But ultimately, the point here is, you might have a PDF that you want to display on your web page, right? So that's where an embed or an object tag would come into play. But 9 times out of 10, you'll use an iframe. And even an iframe, if done correctly, you can still do a PDF in there as well. So earlier, someone had asked, well, can you embed CSS and JavaScript into HTML? And you absolutely can. It's not as common as what we've seen before, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see this because of how my screen sharing is, but there is an alert that popped up on my page. I just threw it in the chat where it says, "Hello world." And that happened because we added a script element and we have an alert inside of these parentheses. We're saying hello world. So if you were to go in there and you change hello world to I'll be back, right? Now, I can't use multiple single quotes, so I'll change it to double quotes. We'll get into why that's the case in a future lesson. But if I was to hit refresh, it changes the text to say, I'll be back. Outside of that, that's really the important thing to understand is whatever is inside of that script is going to be executed when that page loads. Now, we haven't got into JavaScript. So again, this is just allowing you to have a JavaScript reference without having a JavaScript file that you're referencing. Not as common, but you will still see sites that do that. Now we're going to get into what are called form elements. And this is where once we go over this, I want to make sure we're, do a temperature check here. I think we're actually getting ready for a break here soon. And if not, I think we'll just go ahead and take one here shortly. So for form elements, who here has walked down the street and had someone stop them and try to get them to sign up for something, right? Maybe it's a political organization. Maybe you're trying to get sold some kind of internet service, phone service, right? I'm sure we've all had that before. When that happened, just yesterday. Yeah, we have some people at my office that are on the corner every single day. Um, you can see them every day and they still will stop you. So keeping that in mind, the reason I bring that up is because when they walk around, they're carrying a form. It's a way to collect information. And websites are no different. A form is designed to collect information from a user. Now, each form is going to be different, right? Maybe one form is to sign up for a newsletter. Maybe another form is to enter a contest. And then maybe another form is to reach out to a company because they didn't ship you out the right item. Now, what we do here is the form element itself, and without getting too, deep in the weeds, we have what's called an action. Okay. And the action is saying, hey, this is going to do something. Okay. This is where we want the page to go. Now, the method, there's a couple different methods we'll have. And again, we'll get into this when we get into JavaScript, especially. We have a post, which means to save or to send, and a get means to retrieve. Okay, so what this form is saying is we want to send some data, and when that data is sent, we're going to direct them to this page. Now, the more important part here, and what we're going to look at, is we have form elements, right? Now, you can use these elements outside of this form tag, okay? But it has to be inside of a form to actually collect data, okay? So outside of this form, I could have what's called an input tag, which is a self-closing tag, okay? I could say within an input, you can have what's called a placeholder attribute. I could say placeholder text, right? So if I hit refresh, you'll see here, I created a new element that says placeholder text is placeholder text, but it's outside of this form. So if I was to type anything in here and then submit the form knows nothing about it. Okay. So by adding these inputs, these form elements inside of this form tag, it collects everything together so that if you want to do something with that data, it's grouped together and you can route it accordingly. So there's a lot of different form elements. We're not even going to touch all of them right now. But like we already saw, there's an input element, which is a way for someone to input information. But we also have labels. So that's a way to have text to organize these inputs. And again, just implicitly in all of this is SEO. It's all about readability, all about accessibility. Okay. Because we'll see here with the label, for example, it's saying label, and this label is for name. And we see here the input has a name of name, which is kind of confusing, right? When you say name equals name. So what we could do instead is we could do first name. So then we change the label for, we could do F name, or we just do first name, okay? And then here on this input, I could change the name to first name. So visibly, the only thing that changed was the label text. But underneath the hood, we're tying this label in with this input by the for and passing in a phrase and making sure that input name has that same phrase. It's the same way with this text area. We're giving it a name of message to signify that this form element is called message. And then we have a button here at the end that a type of submit. There's several different kinds of buttons, but what this is saying is when this is submitted, it should submit the form. So, or clicked, it should submit the form rather. I can put David Marshall, testing out the form. If I hit submit, if the form is hooked up, it does refresh. We just don't have that page anywhere, right? So the cool thing about text areas as well is you can set how many rows you want. So based on how much how much text you expect, I could change this to 10 rows. And you see it's a pretty big text area, right? Or I could change it back to 2, and it's only 2 lines long. What questions do we have right now before we move on? I'm going to actually. So what I did here before I answer Omar's question, we have a placeholder attribute, which I showed you before. So here in the text area, we see it says text area, right? So let's change it to enter your message here. So it tells you what it's for, right? But then I could go, I am unhappy with your services. So that placeholder message disappears as soon as you start typing. It's just a way to help signify what the user should be inputting into that input. So Omar asks, the label and the input are connected through the ID. The for and the ID have to be the same. So it's going to be the for and the name. So the ID itself, this is when we get into like CSS and JavaScript, the ID is a way to help select elements. And an ID, again, I don't want to go too far into it, but think about an ID like a driver's license, for example. You should only have one of those, right? You shouldn't have 5 driver's licenses. So an ID should be a unique identifier for an element. But when it comes to forms, the label has the for, right? And then it's going to go to the name. Okay. So what questions do we have before we move on? But that is a great question, Omar. Thank you for bringing that up. I think, yeah, we have one more exercise, and then I think we'll take a break there. Are you good with that, Ivan? Awesome. All right. So now we have what are called table elements. And table elements are a way to help structure content on a page like a spreadsheet, like a table, right? I will say table elements are not as utilized as they used to be, but it's something that is still very important to understand. I still use them professionally quite a bit, but once we get into CSS, you'll realize why not as many people use them. But really what this is doing is it's meant to structure your content or your data in a table format. And what I mean by that is, let's go ahead and beautify this again. We see that there's a caption for that table, right? So we see price and table. But inside of that table, we have a couple different elements. We have a TR, which is a table row. Okay, so thinking a row, horizontal. And then inside of this table row, we have what are called table headers. Okay, so if you see here, we have 2 of them. We have item and price. And what this is doing is signifying that there should be 2 columns of data, right? So we see 2 vertical columns being item and price. And then every time we add a new table row element, we'll have 2 table data items. And inside of those elements, we put the content we want. So when we look here visually, we have table row, as I highlight, table row, table row, table row, table row, table row, right? And inside of that table row, we have a TD and a TD, or a table data item, table data item. So if you want, we can jump in, and why don't we, let's add a new table header, right? And we could say TH, we could say quantity. So if I was to refresh, you'll notice we have a new header element, but there's nothing inside of there because every single table row after that just has two table data item elements. So now what I could do is I could go TD and I could say 1. I'll copy and paste and do 2. Copy and paste and say 20. So now if I was to hit refresh, we see that all those elements are not only added on the page, but organized. And again, that caption, we could change this here to say price table and quantity. If I hit refresh, it's organized there. It's centered text on top of the table. So let's go ahead and put all this together. Let's go ahead and get some typing going on. So what you're to do is go to this link here, the HTML cheat sheet. We're going to find an HTML element that's new that you haven't found. You're going to choose that element, and then you're going to use this code editor here, and you're going to add that element to the page and make it look and work as expected. So we're going to take about 4 minutes. Let's go ahead and try that before we take a break. Okay. So we'll click here on cheat sheet. So go through here. There's a lot of different elements. And let's go ahead and find a way to do that. And if you are unable to take a screenshot or if you don't know how to, that's totally fine. Just go ahead and share your text in the chat. The easiest way when you do that, if you go to your Slack, I'm going to take a screenshot here, the Slack text area, you're going to see a little block that has the opening and closing carets there. If you look there at the screenshot, if you paste your code inside of there, it'll actually format the way that you had it in Codio. So it makes it a lot more organized to read. So especially as we progress, when you have questions about your code, if you can do that with your code and share it, it's going to be a lot easier for myself or Veronica to troubleshoot. So let's go ahead and take a few minutes. I'm going to see if there's anything here I don't recognize. And then we will take our 10-minute break. Actually, I've never seen one of these. So what you can do is if you find that element, you can just click this little button here in this clipboard and just paste it into your body. So click beautify, hit refresh. Okay. I don't remember where they're at from France. Andres. Okay. All right. So let's see what we've got going on here. What elements is everyone choosing here? Looks like Dragos is typing. Really simple one. Okay, so yeah, you used a pre-element and then you used the Q or the quote element as well. So let's look here. I'm trying to figure out where that opening brace is coming from at the beginning of your page. But outside of that, it looks great. Let's see. Yeah, I've got that song stuck in my head too, Veronica. So it looks like Joseph did a mark element. Awesome. Wonder if anyone chose that. If I remember right. Yep. So let's go back to search. Yep, it highlights, which is interesting. You don't see that very often anymore. Okay, gotcha. You just didn't refresh. I was like, I could not find that bracket in your code. It was driving me crazy. All right. Mohammed did a time element. Yes, awesome. Yeah, you're going to find date and time elements are very common. They can also be a huge headache when you have to convert time zones. So if you're still working on it, please share it in the chat. But we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So what time? I'm trying to get the conversions. I need to have that calculator up. So it's 30 after for me. What time is it for everyone right now?
It's 8:30 p.m.
Okay, so still 30 after. So let's go ahead. It's 31 now. Let's come back at 30 or 41 after.
Awesome.
I'll stop. To be fair, I was thinking about the basket too. So I'm right there with you. All right. Let me know when y'all can see my screen. Cool. All right. So we just went over some HTML element exploration. Thank you everyone for sharing what you did there in the chat. So just remember these exercises, they're not always graded, right? Like in this instance, this isn't for a grade. It's just how do you learn how to code until you actually code and you start building. So if it's easier for you to do it later, that's totally fine. Or if you're not present right now, obviously you're not coding along, but just going to encourage you to keep doing that, keep participating in the chat so that we can all be helping each other and making sure, none of us should be going through alone, right? And that's the whole point of the chat, is a way to help each other through that. So we're gonna talk about HTML attributes. So again, we've kind of already gone over this, but an attribute is something that gives an element a little bit of flair, a little bit of personality, something that doesn't always translate in a visual, but gives it a little bit of extra information as well. So we've already seen the attributes for an image tag, right? Where we would add the source. If I still have this up here, I guess it didn't want to save, and that's fine. But when we added the image element, we had the source attribute, and we passed in the address or the path to that image. In this example, we have what's called a class attribute. And we haven't got into classes quite yet. We're going to see that with CSS. But for this example, it's a way to help identify that element based on a class, which means when we use CSS, we can target this element based on its class. So to give you guys a little bit of preview on that, let's have a p tag here in CodePen, and I'll say hello SD6. Okay. Now in CSS, give you a little bit of preview, we could target this by, if we have a class of text, I could do a dot text, and we have our curly braces, and I could say background color of blue. So you see here, that's pretty hard to read. Let's try light blue. So what I did is I targeted this element based on the class. Now, if I was to remove this attribute, well, it's not going to work, right? Because I'm trying to target it with this class. Like I can't target this element without specifying the selector. There's going to be attributes. There's other ways we could do it. But again, the significance here is we have a class attribute of editorial note. So in our CSS, or as we'll learn in our JavaScript, we could target this paragraph element based on the class attribute. So looking here, something to understand about attributes is there should be a space between the attribute and the element name. Okay, so we couldn't have p class equals text because that would be a p class element. I have no idea what a p class element is, right? But if I was to change that to p space class, that's different. More than that, we need to have the attribute name followed by the equal sign. Now, some people may like to have a space between the attribute name and the equal sign and the text. That's allowed. Veronica, feel free to correct me, but typically you try not to add spaces when it comes to things like this unless necessary. So typical best practice is just don't add a space between the attribute and the equal sign. Veronica agrees. That's why she's my favorite. Just kidding, but she is. And then we have the attribute value wrapped with opening and closing quote marks. Now, again, we could have a single quote here. We could have a double quote here. What you can't do is have a single quote beginning and a double quote at the end. If you notice here, the text, notice how it's all green because it's expecting a closing quote there at the end, right? So if I change that back to a single quote, we're good to go. So we'll get into that more later, but just remember, whatever you open this attribute value with, you need to close it with the same thing. Now, let's look here at the image element again, right? So there's a handful of attributes we can have with an image element. We can have the source, as we talked about. So if I actually go here to beautify, if you noticed, there is a space left here, right? But if I go to beautify, it removes that space. Kind of sign that maybe best practice not to have it. So we have our source attribute, which is linking this to this image URL, which appears to be hosted at Flickr. Then we have our alt, right? An image of Big Sur. So if I was to break this and hit refresh, like we saw before, an image showing that it's not loading, and the alternative text of an image of Big Sur. So let's go ahead and fix that. And then we're setting the width and the height. So again, the source is going to be what specifies the location of the image, whether it's locally hosted in the website's database or the server, or it could be hosted somewhere else. Now, I'm curious how, if other people have run into this before, do you think it's best practice to host or to reference someone else's image on their page? See a few people typing there. Probably not, Omar says. And then we have, if you're taking images from someone else, always ask for permission and reference. So it's an it depends situation. Some web pages will allow you to do what's called hot linking. So you could reference their hosted image from their page. The problem is, imagine you are a big company and you are referencing someone else's image and you keep getting hits to your web page. So that's going to reference their page. They're going to get all the traffic. They're going to get upset, right? And they're probably going to cut you off. And like Omar said, if you need them available all the time, you can't always be sure they're going to be available. So it is best to have locally hosted images when possible. But also, like Dragos mentioned, you need to have a reference to someone else's image, right? If you're taking it from someone else. So in this instance, it's just an example. It's not a big deal. But if you were to design a web page and you're using someone else's image, unless they explicitly say otherwise, you need to attribute where that page or that image is coming from. So good thing to be mindful of as we're developing our pages is it actually common source? Can you actually use this image or is it copyrighted? Now, again, the alt attribute is just going to specify the text description of the image, which, screen readers or if the image doesn't load. So we've seen that a handful of times now. And then we have the height and the width is going to set the height and the width of the image based on pixels. Now, what's important to understand about this is if an image is a certain size, so let's say if I was to right click on this because it's hosted elsewhere, the original image is, if it'll tell me here, if I hover over this title, it's like, you can tell it's not a square. That's really the point, right? But the way we're designing it or doing the attributes is it's a square. So you notice the image is a little skewed. It's not as clear as what we're seeing here, right? And it would be even more skewed if I did like 800 by 50, right? You do that, and look, it just doesn't look good. So it's important to understand just because you want an image to be a certain dimension doesn't mean it's always going to look good that way. So there's ways we can get around that. But the best way is just to, if you can, resize the image and just display it based on that size. So if you can have a square image, that's better, right? And then trying to take a horizontal or a rectangle image and trying to turn it into a square. So in this exercise, we're going to get into a little bit more attributes, right? This one won't take too long. So similar to what we did before, let's go ahead and choose an HTML element from that HTML cheat sheet, okay? And then we're also going to go to this HTML attributes page, which is going to give us a list of attributes. And the nice thing is it's going to tell us which attribute or which elements has this attribute, right? So you'll see here, action is only available on the form element. Whereas you might go here and you see background. Well, you can do that on a handful, right? So what we're going to do is find an element, and we're going to find an attribute we want to use, and then we're going to put it here in our code editor. So I am, and obviously you are encouraged to be doing this as well. So let's find an element I'm not super familiar with. One I've seen, but haven't used a lot. Let's do address. Can't say I've ever used an address element before. And then let's see if address is on here. Oh, man, it's not. So not all elements have attributes, right? And that's okay. If we click through on that, we would actually see that this element only includes global attributes. So if you want to dive into that a little bit more, you can. There's some like events that we could add on there, but we're not quite ready for that. So let's find a different one. We could do, let's see if block quote has any attributes. It has a site attribute. Not really gonna see that as well. Let's look at the HR, which is a horizontal rule. I like this one. Now you'll notice here on MDN, you might see a trash can and you might see the triangle. What that means is this is deprecated, so it's not encouraged to be used anymore. And then the triangle is non-standard, right? So it may not work on every browser. So I know this isn't necessarily best practice because it's deprecated, but we'll go ahead and use it anyway. So we'll do hello, goodbye. We're going to add an HR element in between. And then let's do width. And it tells us that based on a pixel or percentage value. So let's try just 50 pixels. Let's see what happens there. Okay. So we see here it's centered, right? And it's only 50 pixels. What if I do 50%? Okay, cool. So it's taken up 50% of the page. And we can look here at multiple attributes, right? So I could set align. I could do left. So now it's aligned to the left side of the page. Okay. So what attributes have y'all chosen? And if you have the ability to screenshot, great. And if not, we'll go ahead and move forward. But again, the benefit here to MDN is we do have this attribute reference page. But if you're really curious about an element, you can see all the attributes when you go to that elements page. So if you're curious about an H1 or an H6, it's going to tell you here, they only include the global attributes we talked about before. If we go to the OL, which is called an ordered list, you'll see that there's a reverse attribute, a start attribute, and a type attribute. Okay. So MDN is going to be super helpful for when we're going over these. I see Veronica typing. What is she going to tell us here? All right, while she's typing, we're going to go ahead and prepare for the lab. Oh, nothing important. Okay. But she's right. I mean, MDN is awesome. I still use it on a fairly consistent basis. So for the last 30 minutes here, we're going to go ahead and build a web page. And this is going to be it's kind of what in the United States we had what's called Craigslist, but a little bit more common would be Facebook Marketplace, right? So we're going to make a classified ad for a amazing laptop for sale. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to take this image here and we want to replicate it as closely as possible. Okay. Now, again, you're going to see here, there's not a lot of styling, right? This would not be something that I would take to my boss and be like, hey, I'm ready to put this out on the internet. But that's not the goal. The goal here is to figure out, well, which elements do we need to create this page? And no, that's not my laptop that fell into the water. Veronica, thanks for reminding me. But on here, you're going to notice there may be an element or two that you haven't seen yet. And part of that is we want to figure out how resourceful you are in figuring that out. But for our first exercise, you will have everything you need to do it. Okay. So what we've done is we've structured everything out for you. So here's step one, setting up the HTML file and the metadata. And then we're going to add the product details. And then we're going to add contact information. Okay. So every step here is going to tell you what you need to do. But if you're stuck, like in real life, if you were stuck, you'd have a lead engineer or a senior engineer to help you. But if you're stuck, you can open up this window or this little arrow here, and it's going to give you the code that you need to get started. Okay. So what we're going to do is take about 10, 15 minutes. I'm going to have y'all go ahead and dive into this. And then once we get to that point, I'm going to go ahead and do the project as well. And then we'll take some time at the end to answer any questions. But before we start, I told you before, there's a little shortcut to create that structure. So if you go into this index.html file, just do an exclamation mark and hit tab. And when you do that, it's going to create the skeleton for you. So you already have the doctype. You have the HTML tag, which can actually set what language it's going to be, right? So it automatically does English, but if you decide you want to make a website in a different language, you can change that. And then we have some meta tags here. Don't worry so much about the viewport. We'll talk about that when we get into CSS, but it creates the title tag, and then it creates the body as well. So it's 3 after now. Let's go ahead and go to 15 after. Let's see how far we can get with this. Okay, this is your first legitimate lab. So step by step, you have everything here you need to be able to design that page. And if you need to reference it, you can always click here on this link and you can view the preview of that image. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that. If you have any questions, we're going to be monitoring the live chat. And then at 15 after, I'll go ahead and duplicate this code. I'll step through everything and then we'll go from there. So again, any questions, you can direct it in the live chat or you can do in the extra help as well. And yeah, Mohammed, if you're already done, go ahead and share a screenshot. That's awesome. Awesome. So thanks to everyone who shared their progress in the chat. Had a couple questions about how to kind of render some of the content. So it was a great question, and we're going to go ahead and go over that, right? So first step here is setting up the basic HTML document. So this is really the first thing you should always do when building an HTML document. So again, what we can do, the exclamation sign, hit pound, and it populates everything we need, right? So on step 2, it's saying that we should add a title for the ad. Well, the nice thing is we already have that title tag, right? So we can just go ahead and add laptop for sale. And I think it's amazing laptop for sale, but we're going to go a little out of the book here. And then step 3, in that head element, we want to add the favicon using an image called logo.ico. So I'm a big proponent for typing things out because that's how you get that muscle memory. But for the sake of this exercise, we're going to go ahead and copy everything over. Okay. Now, when it comes to the head element, it doesn't really matter the order that we place things when it comes to metadata. Now, when we get into CSS and JavaScript, it is important the order that we put things in, but for right now, not a huge deal. So if you remember, we add a link element. We're saying the relationship's an icon. We say where that image is hosted, and then we say what kind of type this link is. So if I was to hit refresh, or if I was to open up this page in a new browser, let's make sure everything's looking correct. Yep, so we see a little purple icon there, and we see laptop for sale. Awesome. So again, as always, test often, right? It's always easier to figure out if you broke something step at a time rather than 20 minutes later and you have no idea where things went wrong. So we've got the first 3 steps here. Okay, seems like everyone was able to get that. Now, for the product details, let's go ahead and add that H1 element. So does everyone remember why do we have an H1 compared to an H2 here? It's like Dragos is typing H1 is the main title and shows the importance of that content. That's absolutely right. So we have that H1 here where it says amazing laptop for sale. Now we're going to take an image element to display an image of that photo, right? So we already have an image hosted in our file tree called laptop.jpg. So if I add that in there, we have our source attribute, which is directing us to where that image is. And we have the alt text of brand new laptop. See? Awesome. Okay. So the nice thing is here, if you remember block elements, we briefly touched on, a block element gets its own line, right? So this way we don't really have to worry about the image being next to the H1, right? Because they're both block elements, so they have their own separate lines here. Keeps it organized pretty easily. So now we're going to do a unordered list, which we briefly touched on, but didn't really get into it. So an unordered list is a bulleted list, or you can change what the bullets look like, little circles, or we have what are called ordered lists. So again, in this situation, we just have an unordered list. An ordered list would be 1, 2, 3, ABC, Roman numerals. So let's go ahead and add this unordered list underneath. Okay. Now, as we do that, what's important to understand here, and let's go ahead and beautify this again, is we need this UL. Okay. So this UL is saying, hey, we're making an unordered list, and inside of here is going to be each list item. So again, if you hover over the element, it'll give you a description of what it is. But we have a list item of what brand it is, what condition, what price, right? So this way you can signify what each item should be. And there is no limit to how many list items you have within a list. So we've got that there. Now we need to add some contact information, right? So in our example, what we have is a paragraph tag after the unordered list with example@email.com. Now, if I wanted to make it easy for someone to email me, right? Maybe I wanted to click on that email. How would we do that? I'm trying to remember how we could do that. I know we went over it briefly, but how could we click on that text and make it a link? There's a certain element that we talked about. Yep, it would be our hyperlink or a tag. Now, what we could do, and we didn't go over this, but if we do our href, we do mail to, so mailto colon, and the email that we want it to go to. So you're not going to see it when I click on this, but it would actually take me to my mailbox application and send an email to that email. Now, we need to include a phone number, so we'll use a paragraph tag as well, right? And again, with paragraph tags being block elements, they're all on their own line. And we need a fake address. They're at Fake Street and Fake Town at Fakesville. Man, got to be some really great people living there. Okay. So we've created the basic copy or text for our listing, but now we need to make the contact form. So this is where we want to have a form element. I'm going to do this one from scratch because I like form elements. So we'll do form. Okay. Now, we haven't really learned why the action matters yet. So we're not going to really touch on that at the moment. If you go here and you click through, you're going to see there's no action here. But if I was to type form and hit tab, it will automatically add that action attribute. Okay. So inside of the form, we need to collect the data. So we can have a label, right? And we'll see here, the way we have it set up is label for email, and then we have everything else here as well. We have our ID and we have our name, okay? So let's go ahead, we'll do label for email, or we'll do name first, sorry. Label for name, we'll say name, and I'm gonna add a space here, right? I want a little bit of space between the inputs. So I'll do input. When you hit tab, it'll automatically default to type text, which is really nice. So I'm going to do name is name, and we'll do ID name as well. I'm not a huge fan of having names and IDs as the same, but for right now, that's just kind of what we're going with. And then also do a placeholder of name. I know that's not in the example, but it's good. Now, did anyone notice this attribute here of required? What do you think that might do? If you don't know, that's totally fine. I'd love to see some guesses on there while I'm doing the rest. I'm just going to copy and paste this. We'll do label for email. Type is email. It does not allow submitting the message if the fields are not filled out. Yep. So we can add that required attribute to any input so that inside of that form, it cannot be submitted unless not only is it filled out, but valid, right? Based on the type of input we use, it will actually validate what we need. So let's go and hit refresh. Make sure we're good. So we've got this here, the email address. I'm not going to add the required on here for right now. Then I'll copy this. Make sure the text area is good. Now, obviously, with the window being smaller, everything kind of gets cut to the bottom. But if you have a bigger window, everything's lined up accordingly. And then we want to have that button, right? So we can copy that into here and have the form. Now, there was a question of, well, in the example, there's a little bit of space between the contact form and the map. What we could do is after the form, we could just add a paragraph tag, right? And you can have it, this one, you can actually have self-closing if you don't have any content. Because what I could do is if I just type the word hello, and I hit refresh, you'll see there's about a paragraph space between that contact form and the text, okay? Now, you could use a BR. Ultimately, we wouldn't even have any HTML to do that. We would actually use CSS. But for our sake, we could do a P tag, or we could do a couple BRs. For right now, it's less important which route you go. That's kind of the fun of software engineering, is there's always multiple ways to do things. But again, once we get into CSS, we're going to get into what's called like margin and padding, and that's how we would set it. So now we need to go to Google Maps and let's find a location that we want to use. So let's find Nintendo in Washington. I don't remember where I think it's Seattle. Okay. Oh, Redmond. That was it. So we will go through and it says to click the menu in the top left corner and do share and embed map. Okay. So we can embed the map here. It gives us that iframe already, which is super helpful. And then inside of here, we'll paste it. And let's see how it looks at that size. Hit refresh. Yeah, it's looking pretty good, right? So I'm not going to get into the pop-up. Someone had asked about that when we submit the form. We're not quite ready for that. But as we see here, it didn't take that much, right, to design a basic listing page. And I'm not saying it's easy. These are all brand new things we've had to learn. But through these 20 or so steps, we were able to take some basic building blocks of HTML and design a fairly fully functioning web page. Okay. So as we close here, before we part ways, again, practice is the important thing here. Okay. So try new things, right? You know, obviously we wanted you to replicate the listing, but go outside of the box a little bit. Try some new elements, try some new attributes, but it's that practicing that's really going to cement everything in for you. So, but what you will need to do before you close this lesson is you will need to make sure that you mark as completed. Okay, without marking as completed, Veronica is not going to be able to go into your assignment and mark that you have done the work that's required for you. Okay, so as we close, just a couple of things we want to reiterate. All right, so HTML is what's considered markup language. So it's the way to take these components or these elements and design a web page, the content and the structure. So we've gone over the basic structure of an HTML document, including the doctype, the HTML tag, the head, and the body. There's other portions, but those are going to be really the main structures. And outside of that, we've talked about different HTML elements like your heading elements, paragraphs, and then we've also created elements by way of attributes, right? So we've created an image element where we link to an image, or a hyperlink element, the A element, and we can direct users to a new page. So this is just the beginning. We're going to get into CSS to figure out how we styled everything. And then the JavaScript is going to be how we interact with the page. But before we close, oh, perfect. We've got a question here. And then anyone else, please drop the questions in the chat. So Mohammed asked, with HTML, you can go around the code in different ways and get the same result. Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what you're trying to do, right? Like I couldn't use a image tag to generate text, right? But based on what you're trying to do, there are multiple ways to accomplish that goal. And that's going to be something you're going to learn as you progress is maybe there's multiple ways to do something, but am I doing it the way that my lead engineer or my supervisor would want me to do it, or am I doing it in the way that's most accessible for users? If it doesn't hit that accessibility point, then probably not the way I want to do it, right? So that's going to be something you're going to learn, but that's only going to come through practice. As you practice and as you do these things, you'll learn what's best practice, like what I should be doing, and maybe what works, but probably not the best approach. So great question, Mohammed. What else? What do we have before we part ways today? Anything else? How are we? We've finished our first official lab. How are we feeling? Let's just throw some emojis in the chat. You don't have to type a sentence, but let's see what we've got. We've got a grinning face. Love it. Tad bit overwhelmed. I mean, that's normal, right? It's new. And that's where Omar. Okay. That one's hard to take sometimes because people use it jokingly, but I do love that one though. So to what Drago said, it's easy to feel overwhelmed with this because it's a lot. You're learning something brand new. But that's where utilizing Veronica as a resource is incredibly important. I've worked with her for well over a year now, and she's going to have the ability to help get on your level and explain things in a way that you need. Maybe I wasn't able to do during class, or maybe you have a question later, right? But you don't have to do this on your own, which is the beauty of this boot camp. Looks like everyone else is feeling great. Awesome. So yeah, on tomorrow, we're going to go over CSS. So if you have any questions before tomorrow's lesson, please reach out to Veronica. You can throw questions there in the extra help channel. If you find anything that's helpful for you, feel free to share it in the resources channel too. It's not, with the last cohort, it was not uncommon for people to be like, hey, I watched this video. It was really helpful. Hopefully this helps. So feel free to share that with your fellows. And yes, Mohammed, one last question, and then we do need to. The autocomplete for HTML, is it only in Codio or can we see it elsewhere? Great question. So that autocomplete is courtesy of a plugin called Emmet. I will share this in the chat. But if you use VS Code, even like a WebWriter or WebStorm, a lot of these IDEs, which we'll get into later, will have this autocomplete. Okay, so it is not just Codio. VS Code has it built in. A lot of these programs you'll use for coding will have it. Now, Notepad, things like that will not. So